This episode of Hellbent for Horror is brought to you by Patreon supporters and listeners like you. If you enjoy Hellbent for Horror, please consider supporting the show by contributing either on our Patreon site or via PayPal. You can find links to both of those on hellbentforhorror.com. And I thank you for helping to sustain the show. Hi, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror. I'm S.A. Bradley, and I'm a lifelong movie lover, but my heart belongs to horror. My biggest thrill, however, is getting to talk to people about this stuff. I really want to start conversations with you. Before I start this episode, I wanted to correct something from the last show, which talked about micro-budget films. I said that Jim Van Bebber's film, Deadbeat at Dawn, was made for $10,000 by using his college loan money. Director Jim Van Bebber contacted me to say that, although it's true he used the $10,000 of his student loan to make the film, there was additional funding through the production. All told, Van Bebber says the budget was $80,000. Jim Van Bebber has integrity around his art, and he wanted to set the record straight, and I respect that. And now, on with the show. Giving birth is a messy business, and usually it's a lengthy process. Before the actual birth, there are labor pains. There are contractions that start the ball rolling, as it were. Art imitates life, and I think the birth of art and pop culture movements are the same way. Rarely does a sound or an image or a mindset just appear out of thin air. There are usually contractions before the birth, incidents that get the ball rolling. Take punk rock, for example. In 1969, while the radio was playing Age of Aquarius, Iggy Pop and his band The Stooges banged out heavy and aggressive music. It was a tough and fast variation on garage rock, and it was punk rock's first contraction. And then in 1973, the New York Dolls first came out. They were an aggressive variation on glam rock, and they were another contraction. And then came the Ramones. The Stooges did something new, but they still had ties to garage rock. The New York Dolls did something new, but they still had ties to glam rock. But the Ramones, four guys in matching leather jackets and matching bowl-cut hairstyles. They could barely play their instruments, so the songs got faster because they lost the beat, more than 160 beats per minute. The Ramones created a sound that, for better or for worse, was immediately identifiable. The Ramones sounded like the Ramones. And that generation of kids who felt alienated by the large arenas and bloated concept albums noticed. The kids who recognized those early contractions knew something was coming. So when this new sound hit, they embraced it as something that spoke to them and for them. And punk rock was born. Now, the term punk rock was invented by rock critics and the fans. The bands I mentioned were just playing the music the way they just wanted to play it. They weren't out there intentionally trying to create a movement, and yet they did create a movement. And that brings me to the birth of what is now called the modern horror movie. For a lot of people, the modern horror era starts in 1960 with Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. Now, there's no doubt that Psycho changed the game and opened new possibilities in horror. But Psycho still has ties to the old guard. It needs to explain everything and restore balance at the end of the movie. In 1965, Roman Polanski's Repulsion took us away from being a spectator and put us in the point of view of a person going insane. More importantly, though, it also dared to give an ambiguous and unsettling ending. But Repulsion still needed to give us an explanation as to why this all happens. So it's another contraction building up to the birth. And that birth comes in 1968. What a year for horror movies. 3 important and groundbreaking films were released that year. Peter Bogdanovich's Targets is literally about how the old movie monsters can't compete with real-life human monsters. But most importantly, we never get a reason why the clean-cut American boy in that movie decides to start shooting random people. He just does it. And then there's Rosemary's Baby, which brings a very important ingredient to the mix. The fear that institutions have failed and that older generations want to kill the new ones. And that brings me to the movie that incorporates all these modern anxieties into one place and then added its own unique bloody fingerprint. That movie was, you guessed it, George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. Like the Ramones, Night of the Living Dead felt like a break from anything that came before it. And like the Ramones, George Romero wasn't out to create a cultural movement. He was just trying to make the scariest movie he could. And yet, create a cultural movement is just what he did. George Romero died on July 16th, 2017, after a brief battle with lung cancer. And for me, personally, it feels like a door closing on an era of movies, horror movies in particular, and pop culture. Even if it's not really. It's probably more of a reminder of my own mortality than anything else. These days, horror and science fiction movies outnumber straight dramas in the multiplexes, and there's more than one big-budget horror show on television. So it's hard to see George Romero's impact without a little context of what it used to be like. I was lucky enough to be around when horror and science fiction was still way outside of the mainstream, back when the San Diego Comic-Con used to draw 300 people, not 300,000. And your only reliable source of horror pop culture was in Starlog magazine, when Stephen King and John Carpenter were the young Turks. And George Romero, the slightly older statesman, was the guy who opened the door a crack to let the barbarians in through the gate. George Romero is certainly on the Mount Rushmore of horror, but Romero's importance, back when pop culture and horror geek culture still had to hide behind the high school bleachers in shame, is immeasurable. Before there was Troublemaker Studios, the first rebel without a crew was George Romero. He not only made his early films in Pittsburgh, he was proud that he made his early films in Pittsburgh. He was an anomaly, a Hollywood outsider by choice. Romero walked out of a Hollywood pitch meeting after the producer answered his phone a third time. George was a true maverick who refused to edit his films to get distribution, even when he didn't have any bargaining power whatsoever. None of the movies he's most remembered for, the original zombie trilogy, were released with an MPAA rating. In fact, George Romero might have been partially responsible for the rating system in movies. More than any other director of his era, George Romero adhered to the renegade mission statement of modern horror, sometimes to his detriment. His movies have a healthy distrust of authority, and he had the guts to leave the world he created broken and leave problems unresolved. He pushed the envelope, and he pushed people's buttons. And Romero believed that being scary didn't mean you couldn't be satirical, intelligent, and thought-provoking. But the greatest thing that George Romero did for horror, and for horror fans, was in how he presented himself. He was a good-natured ambassador for horror at a time when the genre got no respect at all. When it mattered most, Romero proved he could stand your ground with a smile and a sense of humor. The critics could love or hate his movies, and he still did what he wanted to do. Romero showed us that you could make movies anywhere, you could have a good time doing it, and you didn't have to be an asshole either. That is a real maverick. Now, that's not to say that George Romero's career was smooth sailing. He had a one step forward, two steps back career, and many times it was of his own doing. There are some artists who so embody what we personally think or feel so perfectly that if they didn't exist, we'd have to invent them. One of those for me is Guillermo del Toro, a serious artist who never apologized for his love for monsters, and he raised them to the level of poetry and art with his films. And the other for me is George Romero, who made a cheap horror movie with no industry connections that critics had to take seriously. And he did it without a hint of pretension. He's the working-class hero of movie directors, a guy who got a bunch of blue-collar folks from a steel town to set fire to themselves and chew on cow entrails. And they loved him for it, and he championed them. He made the creation of a new monster, the flesh-eating zombie, a community event. Now, in the outpouring of tributes and news reports since Romero's death, he's often called the father of the modern zombie. It's a true enough statement, and it's easy to say, but let's talk about what that really means. Frankenstein, Dracula, the werewolf, the mummy, and even the devil are iconic monsters in cinema. But none of them were invented for the movies. Those monsters come from literature, and some of them are from folk tales that are centuries old. The movies those monsters appear in are adaptations of well-established nightmares. George Romero created an iconic modern monster directly for the screen. There's King Kong and Godzilla, and there's Dan O'Bannon's Alien and the Blob, and then there's the Romero zombie. Not too shabby for a guy who wasn't intending to make a horror film in the first place. George Romero made friends at Carnegie Mellon who would later become business partners. He and his friends started The Latent Image, a company that shot industrial films and commercials around Pittsburgh. But Romero noticed that his big clients would go to a New York or an LA firm to make their prestige commercials instead of using his company. He realized that, even on the commercial level, Pittsburgh was not taken seriously. Romero decided that it was time to take a risk and make a movie. Fuck those guys. Romero and 9 friends created a production company called Image 10. Each person invested $600 to develop Romero's original screenplay into a movie. And that screenplay, of course, was The Whine, W-H-I-N-E, of the Fawn. The Whine of the Fawn. What's that, you say? Was that a working title? Unfortunately, no. As I mentioned before, Romero wasn't intending to make a horror film. Romero's favorite movie was the musical fantasy film The Tales of Hoffmann, and The Whine of the Fawn was an art film, a retelling of Ingmar Bergman's Virgin Spring. However, nobody was interested, and Image 10 decided they needed to do something a little bit more commercial. They decided to try making a horror film. Romero and his writing partner John Russo sat in a room with dueling typewriters. John Russo came up with a story about aliens who come to Earth and eat people. George decided to rip off a Richard Matheson novel called I Am Legend. In that novel, a disease causes global vampirism, and we follow the one man left who may be immune. Romero interpreted the global epidemic story as being about revolution. He saw it as one group overthrowing another, but he wanted to tell that story from the beginning, the start of the revolution. Romero liked Russo's idea about the dead bodies the aliens fed off starting to reanimate. What if the dead stopped being dead? The monsters would still look like regular people, and that would work with the limited budget they had. They took the flesh-eating aliens and made them flesh-eating ghouls. Yes, just like punk rock, the zombie name was coined by critics. A new monster, an egalitarian creature that everyone not only feared, but also related to, was born. Because the living dead are us. Night of the Living Dead didn't look like a normal horror movie. The black and white photography and the documentary style owes more to Italian neorealism than it does horror movies that were popular at the time. And it didn't act like a normal horror movie. Science and the government had no clue what was happening or how to save us. And we weren't going to band together like this was a Howard Hawks movie. We were our own worst enemies. And while we fought each other, more monsters walked up to the front porch. And it sure as hell did not end like any horror movie before it. There are no right answers. Go down to the cellar, stay upstairs. It's not going to matter. Chaos reigns, and the game has already been lost. And the final moments are tragically ironic and devastating and confrontational. And then the movie doesn't end as much as it just stops. It's like the film spooled out of the projector and everyone was left sitting in the dark. With the film completed, George Romero went searching for a distributor for his film, Night of the Flesh Eaters. Yes, Night of the Flesh Eaters. Remember that title, because I'll be coming back to that. Romero shopped his movie around to all the usual exploitation distributors. Even the exploitation guys weren't willing to show the gruesome cannibalism intact. He gets interest from Roger Corman, but only if Romero will change the ending. and George refuses. He sticks to his guns. He finally finds a distributor, the Walter Reed organization, who will take the movie as is, no cuts. The only change they ask for is to change the name of the film. They want to change Night of the Flesh Eaters to Night of the Living Dead. Easy peasy, right? Well, I'll come back to that. Night of the Living Dead was released on October 1st, 1968. The public was not ready for it, and the movie and its creators were pilloried. I think a little context is needed here to see why Night of the Living Dead caused such an uproar. By 1968, most low-budget horror was playing in either grindhouses on 42nd Street or the tamer ones played the Saturday morning matinee kiddie shows. I'm not sure who was responsible, but Night got booked in both. Perhaps it was because the movie was in black and white and it was low budget that the theater owners didn't recognize what they had. But one of the first audiences that saw flesh-eating zombies for the very first time was children. This led to an infamous review by Roger Ebert, whose moral outrage was so strong, the review went national in the pages of Reader's Digest. The movie was saved by a very positive review in Interview magazine that said the movie should play in art houses. Other critics reassessed the film, and over decades it is now considered one of the best and most important horror films ever made. And this is a good time to come back to that title, Night of the Flesh Eaters. This is an example of the one step forward, two steps back career of George Romero, and how, for a phenomenon like Night of the Living Dead to happen, a lot of crazy luck, both good and bad, must come into play. It's ironic, but I think the best thing that could have happened to George Romero was Walter Reed demanding that the title be changed. But it is equally the worst thing that could have happened. And here's why. If the movie went out with the title Night of the Flesh Eaters, I can almost guarantee that the movie would have never been reviewed by critics. They'd have gone to the bar across the street for 90 minutes and then made up a review. And nobody is that stupid to show a movie with flesh eaters in the title to kids. In other words, nobody would have seen it. However, a technical oversight changed the fortunes of Romero and the Image 10 investors. When the lab replaced the title on the film, they neglected to put the copyright seal back on the title. And nobody, not Walter Reed, not Image 10, not even Romero, noticed it. But of course, the wrong people did notice it. And those people started making duplicate copies and distributing them. To make matters even worse, the facility where Image 10 stored all their documentation was destroyed in a flood, including original prints of Flesh Eaters with the copyright on them. Romero and his investors had to watch in horror as their movie was put into public domain. All the international prints of Night of the Living Dead were public domain. Because of this, it is unknown how much money the movie really made. And that's something that's always saddened me. So many directors never truly enjoy the victory of their greatest achievement because of bad business deals or personal issues. It must have been bittersweet for George to have fans tell him how much they loved Night and how they saw it 50 times, knowing that this fan unintentionally lined the pockets of some duplication company. Publicly, Romero shrugged his shoulders, gave that smile and said, "What are you going to do? Hey, it's just business, right?" Yeah, but how's this for just business? Back in 1991, I saw a video on the rental shelf called Night of the Day of the Dawn of... you can look it up. The title is 41 words long, and it covers the entire box. I rented it thinking it was a spoof. What it ended up being was Night of the Living Dead, with new dialogue dubbed in. I think all the dialogue was done by one person, which means Ben's voice was dubbed by a white guy doing Fat Albert voices. And there were silly sound effects and borderline racist jokes. Every 15 minutes or so, there was a splice of footage with a guy wearing a mask. And he would hold up a handwritten sign that said, "Sorry, Mr. Romero." The good news was that Night was enough of a hit that Romero got offers to do other movies. Of course, the investors wanted Romero to make a sequel to Night. Although Romero never denigrated his horror roots, he was very reluctant to do another horror film right away. Ever the iconoclast, Romero knew these money men wanted to typecast him into doing one kind of movie and one kind only, and so he turned them down. He decided to shoot another low-budget film in Pittsburgh, a romantic comedy called There's Always Vanilla. It was a flop. Romero followed it up with Season of the Witch, a return to the supernatural. Season of the Witch used witchcraft as a metaphor for feminist empowerment. Sadly, it was also a flop. His next film, The Crazies, was a horror story and social commentary about a biological weapon accidentally released in a small town. The Crazies has a cult following now, but it was a flop when it came out. Years later, Romero admitted that turning down the investors who wanted him to make another zombie film was probably an error, and it hurt his career. George the iconoclast could be George the artist's worst enemy. Instead of battling for creative control, he'd rather walk and find someone he could deal with. And sometimes that meant lower budgets, and sometimes it meant smaller distribution. His next movie, Martin, had a budget of only $80,000, a third of the budget he had for The Crazies. The movie was shot entirely in real locations, and most of the cast were friends and relatives. And it is one of his very best films. Martin is about a teenager who is either a Nosferatu or he's just a crazy murderer rapist who drinks the blood of his victims. But the movie is really about the struggles of keeping up with a changing world and the fear of becoming obsolete. And the movie introduced special effects wizard Tom Savini, one of Romero's most important collaborators. Martin wasn't a financial success, but it was an artistic one that got good critical reviews. Romero had renewed energy in Martin, and I think collaborating with Savini helped. I think that Romero made his best films when he had strong collaborators. George decided it was finally time to make that sequel to Night of the Living Dead. Unfortunately, it was several years after investors expressed interest, and now he was having trouble finding money. Luckily for him, he is about to meet his next great collaborator, legendary Italian horror director Dario Argento. Argento was a huge fan of the original Night of the Living Dead, and he heard Romero wanted to do a sequel and that he was having trouble financing it. So Argento came up with a deal. He'd get the movie financed if he could have the international distribution rights. And best of all, he'd give Romero complete creative control. As legend has it, Romero shook hands with Argento and called up Tom Savini and said, "Tom, I got us a new gig. Start thinking of ways to kill people." Romero was once again going to push the envelope for on-screen violence, but he also pushed the boundaries of the horror narrative by mixing social satire and comedy with the blood and the gore. He was going to use horror and comedy like Robert Altman did in MASH to comment about the rampant consumerism in the 1970s by taking consumerism literally with flesh-eating zombies. Everything would be pushed to extremes. Dawn of the Dead was Romero's most ambitious film to date and his most wildly entertaining. In Dawn, 4 people wait out the zombie apocalypse in a shopping mall, and the more they get seduced by the creature comforts, the more zombie-like they become. Now, Romero does something interesting here. The beginning of the movie starts tense, and the zombies are scary. Then the movie gets funny, and so do the zombies. But nothing about the zombies has changed. The only thing that has changed was our perspective. In the beginning of the movie, you sympathize with the humans, but by the end of the movie, you're sympathizing with the zombies. Even though they are dead, the zombies look and dress like you and me, and that gives them a rudimentary individuality. In this movie, they are the real cross-section of America, and they are the ultimate outsiders, forever locked out from the good life. The gore in the movie was extreme and over the top. The movie received the kiss of death, an X rating for violence from the MPAA. George refused to cut any of the violence, and he rejected the X rating. He decided to release it unrated in theaters, which was unheard of. Without a rating, the marketing of the movie would be hampered because a lot of newspapers and television stations wouldn't be allowed to run any ads. And yet, due to strong word of mouth and Starlog magazine, the movie found its audience. By the way, that was easily the goriest issue of Starlog ever, a year before Fangoria was born. I wouldn't be half surprised if that was one of the reasons that Fangoria was born. And Dawn of the Dead was a hit. The critics praised not only the movie, but also Romero for standing his ground for his art. George gambled, and this time he won. Dawn of the Dead was the game changer that restarted his career. Dawn's success started a golden age for Romero, and he became synonymous with the zombie film. Now, with saying that, I think it's time for just a little bit more context. Dawn of the Dead was a hit in 1978 terms, in a genre that was growing its fan base, but horror was nowhere near mainstream popularity. As a horror movie, Dawn was a hit by grossing $5 million domestically and $50 million internationally. George Romero became a household name in Europe and in American homes with a subscription to Cinema Fantastique. I don't say this to undercut Romero's achievements at all, but to reinforce how much Romero endured with patience and determination. Because the tributes since George's death, they make it sound like once he was called the father of the zombie, he was bestowed a level of honor forevermore. It makes it sound like zombies were popular as soon as they were invented, and that's just not the case. As hard as it is to believe, not every horror fan liked zombie movies. It was a dirty little niche of horror, and it was considered an acquired taste for real freaks. So even though he had a hit, and critics praised him, he was back in the woods of Pittsburgh with his loyal movie family making his next film. Now that we got the context out of the way, let me tell you how much of a god he was at that time for those people who did have subscriptions to Cinema Fantastique. He was rumored to be attached to every upcoming horror project. He was collaborating with Stephen King, and there were rumors they were going to make The Stand into a movie. Of course, it didn't happen. But his next movie wasn't a horror film. It was a gentle movie about the struggle to keep your art pure and yourself honest. Night Riders used a traveling Renaissance Fair troupe as a stand-in for a film crew, and George gives us a heartfelt insight into how hard it is to balance ideals and commerce. It wasn't a hit when it came out, but it's gotten a cult following because it feels so personal. Romero hits a real high watermark in his popularity with Creepshow, a love letter to EC Comics that he and Stephen King collaborated on. It's tongue-in-cheek, and it's creepy, and it's funny, and it's infectiously fun. It was a commercial success, and it led to Romero creating and executive producing the television show Tales from the Dark Side. He made his movies in Pittsburgh with his friends on his own terms, and he broke the rules and became a beloved cult figure with a television show and a hit movie. Like I said, if he didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. By the early 1980s, horror was having a resurgence and Romero was riding high. And then a funny thing happened. It was supposed to have been the Gone with the Wind of zombie movies. With Creepshow's success, it was the perfect time to make the Dead films a trilogy with a third film. But when George showed his investors a script for a movie that would have to be released unrated, they slashed his $7 million budget in half. George refused to tone down his artistic integrity for an R rating, and so he rewrote the script to scale down the scope. He had to do this 5 times, shrinking the movie until the investors finally were satisfied. Because this wasn't 1978 anymore. Now there was gold in them there horror movie hills. George the iconoclast ran into the buzzsaw of corporate profit margins, and George the artist was the one who suffered for it. Day of the Dead boasted the most stunning and disturbing special effects yet. Thinking about some of them gets hairs going up on my neck. But the reduction of the scope shows through with a very talky film, which is ironic because the movie is about how lack of communication will lead to humanity's downfall. And that may have been the key reason that Day of the Dead was a box office failure. Romero's patented anti-establishment commentary and dark vision was out of step with most moviegoers who just wanted Top Gun or something funny like Reanimator. George gambled, and this time he lost. It took 3 years before Romero released another film, and Monkey Shines is about a quadriplegic trapped by his psychotically devoted helper monkey. It was his first studio film, and it was a critical and box office failure. In 1990, Romero collaborated again with Dario Argento, who also financed the movie again. Two Evil Eyes had each of them direct a segment based on Edgar Allan Poe stories. Unfortunately, that movie failed as well. He reunited with Stephen King in 1993 for The Dark Half, which I really felt was a return to form for Romero. But horror movies had fallen out of favor, replaced by psychological thrillers with serial killers by then, and the film underperformed. And it was about this time that George Romero kind of disappeared for the rest of the 1990s. But during that drought, those of us who were fans of the man and his movies got rewarded with reminders of why he was so special. Document of the Dead was a documentary that was shot during the filming of Dawn of the Dead. Filmmaker Roy Frumkes was given full access, and we got to see Romero as the smiling, benevolent leader we always knew he was. And now we had proof of what we knew all along, that working on a Romero film was like being in a playground. It was a celebration of the joys of pretend. It was a community block party. And then there was the book, The Zombies That Ate Pittsburgh, by Paul A. Gagné. And we found out how mutual the love between Romero and Pittsburgh was. How it was just a given that people would show up to get paid $1 to be a zombie for George. And how critics who trashed his movies would call him up and ask if they could be zombies. And how George laughed it all off and took the highs with the lows. Well, at least for the first 40 years of his career, he laughed it off. In 1996, something very strange started to happen. A video game called Resident Evil was released, and it had a lot of similarities to the zombie universe that Romero had created. The game was a hit, and just like that, the zombie entered the pop culture mainstream. When the sequel to the game was released, Romero was commissioned to make a live-action commercial for the Tokyo market. The game company was so impressed, they offered George the directing job when a movie version of the game was made. George, the iconoclast, turned it down. He said, "I don't want to make another film with zombies in it, and I couldn't make a movie based on something that ain't mine anyway." However, George the artist reconsidered, and he wrote a script for the first movie in the series, and the game company rejected it. Ain't that just the shit? They rejected the script from the guy they ripped off in the first place. George Romero seemed to be suffering the slow death of 1,000 homages. Studios were making zombie films, and Romero found himself writing story drafts of movies that were flat-out rip-offs of his own work. The frustrating thing was that George had a script for his fourth zombie film, Dead Reckoning, that he couldn't get anyone to fund. They wanted zombie films, just not a Romero zombie film. There's a story about how film director John Milius called George on the phone and said, "I want to make one of those Return of the Living Dead movies." The problem was, George didn't make Return of the Living Dead. Instead of insulting Milius for not even bothering to do any research before the call, George politely said, "That's not my thing, man." Then Universal remade Dawn of the Dead, which he was not asked to be involved in. And that was about the time that Smiling George became Cranky George. However, Universal suddenly found the money to pony up to make Romero's fourth zombie film, now named Land of the Dead. It was rated R. Land of the Dead didn't land well with some of the die-hard fans, and I think some of that is because he was now Cranky George. People felt his social satire was too on the nose, and was no longer subtext, and it was too broad. Maybe it says more about us, how it's easier to enjoy social commentary about 1978 or 1985, but we didn't enjoy the iconoclasm when it was targeted on us. And then came The Walking Dead. and Grumpy George became Bitter George. And I completely get it. Like I said, it only took about 40 years, but the shit wore down his magnanimous nature. It was one thing to not make any money on this stuff when nobody was. When San Diego Comic-Con only got 300 attendees instead of 300,000. And even with all the homages, you can say it's the highest form of flattery. For a while. But then, homage becomes a billion-dollar business. And they name drop you for street cred, but they don't hire you. And they don't pay you. All I can say is, well, at least at the commercial breaks, they don't have a guy with a mask on holding a handwritten sign that says, "Sorry, Mr. Romero." But my heart is lightened by the sheer amount of love that is pouring out for George right now. It's wonderful that people are looking back and realizing, even marveling, at what George has done. And yes, there's a lot about being the father of the zombie, which is quite appropriate. But there's just as much about what an inspiration he was, and what a stand-up guy he was. How he always had time for the fans and other artists. And when I was a kid in Pennsylvania, who was full of dreams that he was sure could never happen to a kid in Pennsylvania, I found George. He said you could make movies anywhere, and you could have a good time doing it, and you didn't have to be an asshole either. So, bye, George. I know your ride's here, and I know it's time to go. But one last thing, a proper send-off. It's the best homage I think that's possible. In the popular video game Call of Duty, there's an add-on named Call of the Dead. It downloads a lot of horror characters for you to try and kill. And one of them looks an awful lot like George Romero. His only name is the Director. And he is impossible to kill. 'Cause you can't kill the boss. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/Hellbent for Horror, and my Twitter handle is Hellbent Horror. You can find Hellbent for Horror on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. And H4H has its own app. You can download it from the Google or Amazon store for Android, and the iPhone version is available on the iTunes store. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay hell-bent.